Ironically, Reagan had begun as a New Deal Democrat who admired Roosevelt as an inspirational leader. By the time he entered the White House in 1981, shortly before his 70th birthday, Reagan had rejected the activist welfare state legacy of the New Deal era. He stated, "In the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." Reagan and his allies proceeded to reshape the political and social landscape of the nation along conservative lines. Americans knew Ronald Reagan mainly from his Hollywood movies and television appearances. Although he never a big star, on screen he appeared tall, handsome, and affable, appealing qualities that continued through his presidency. As president of the Screen Actors Guild, Reagan had cooperated with investigations of Hollywood communists. In the 1950s, he hosted General Electric Theater on TV and shifted towards pro-business conservatism. After he played a leading role in Republican Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign, wealthy conservatives convinced Reagan to run for governor of California. In 1966, he defeated Democrat Governor Edmund G. Brown, winning 72% of the vote in Orange County. He won re-election in 1970. As governor, Reagan cut the state welfare rolls, placed limits on the number of state employees, and funneled a large share of state tax revenues back to local government. He vigorously attacked student protesters and black militants, tapping into the conservative backlash against 1960s activism. When Reagan entered the White House in January 1981, his supporters confidently predicted that the Reagan Revolution would usher in a new age of American political life. A supply-sided economic theory, dubbed Reaganomics, dominated the administration's planning and helped to redirect American economy. Keynesians traditionally favored moderate tax cuts and increases in government spending to stimulate the economy and reduce unemployment during recessions. Supply-siders called for simultaneous tax cuts and reductions in public spending, a plan they claimed would stimulate consumption and employment through new investment. To put more disposable income in the pockets of the rich, 1981 tax reform cut the maximum income tax from 70% to 50%, lowering the maximum capital gains tax from 28% to 20%, and eliminated the distinction between earned and unearned income, a boon to renters and investors. A companion Omnibus Reconciliation Act cut spending for more than 200 social and cultural programs, from housing and food stamps to the arts. At the same time, Reagan greatly increased the defense budget. Organized labor faced a new hostility. Reagan fired 13,000 air traffic controllers in response to what he considered an illegal strike. Conservative appointees to the National Labor Relations Board and the federal courts toughened their anti-union position. In the quest for deregulation, Reagan appointed conservatives to head the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, those who favored business over consumers, abolishing or weakening hundreds of rules. Wall Street also benefited as the Justice Department, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and other agencies all gave business a freer hand. Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan encouraged these trends, and a wave of market speculation and a series of financial scandals ensued. As we can see from this map, we see the decline in union membership peaking in 1945 and then reaching an all-time low by the 1990s. Hoping to win back disgruntled voters, Democrats chose Carter's Liberal Vice President Walter Mondale as their nominee. Mondale named Representative Geraldine Ferraro of New York as his running mate, a first for women in American politics. Initially, Mondale ran even with Reagan, but the president's enormous personal popularity and the booming economy overwhelmed the Democratic ticket. While Mondale emphasized the growing deficit, calling attention to Americans who were left out of prosperity and promised to raise taxes, Reagan cruised above it all. It was morning again in America, as his campaign ads claimed. In one of the biggest landslides in American history, Reagan won 59% of the popular vote, nearly 75% in Orange County, and carried every state but Minnesota and the District of Columbia. A majority of blue-collar voters cast their ballots for the president, as did 54% of women, despite Ferrara's presence on the Democratic ticket. Supply-sided economics benefited the rich, but when a severe recession hit in 1982, the unemployment rate reached nearly 11%, or more than 11.5 million people, with another 3 million people simply not looking for work. By 1983, unemployment dropped to about 8%, while inflation fell below 5%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose from 776 in August 1982 to an all-time high of 2,722 in August 1987. The administration took credit for the turnaround, hailing the supply-side fiscal policies that had drastically cut taxes and domestic spending, ignoring the Fed's tight money policy, lower energy prices, and huge defense spending, while critics pointed to growing fiscal problems. Reagan had promised to balance the federal budget, but his policies had created the opposite effect, as the national debt tripled and debt service costs soared, creating structural problems with profound and long-lasting implications for the American economy. Foreign investors, attracted by high interest rates on government securities, pushed up the value of the dollar in relation to foreign currencies, making it difficult for foreigners to buy American products while making overseas goods cheaper to American consumers, sparking a persistent trade deficit. The bull market collapsed in October 1987 with the stock market crash, perhaps a response to the raging deficit. Here we see the federal budget deficit and national debt from 1970 to 1998. And then we have tax cuts combined with huge increases in defense spending, creating the sharp increase in budget deficit. Reagan set the tone for an era when he responded to a reporter's question asking him what was the best about America by saying, "Someone can always get rich." Ivan Bursky, later indicted for criminal trading, echoed Reagan by saying, "Greed is healthy." Grimmer realities lay under the surface as the nation moved toward greater inequality, with the middle class shrinking and poverty on the rise. After 8 years of tax cuts, defense buildup, growing budget deficits, and record trade imbalances, the economic future looked uncertain at best, especially for the middle class. The Reagan Revolution benefited the very rich and hurt almost everyone else. While the top 1%'s share of income and wealth soared, real wages fell and poverty rates climbed. Job creation was mostly concentrated on low-wage jobs. The effects were worse for minorities. By 1992, 33% of all African Americans lived in poverty, as did 29% of Hispanics. The rate was especially high amongst Puerto Ricans, yet low among Cuban Americans. In 1954, the year of Brown versus Board of Education decision, black families earned about 53% of the income of white families. This figure rose to 60% in 1969 and peaked at 62% in 1975. Meanwhile, affirmative action was weakened by the 1978 Back case, and courts backed away from busing to achieve racial balance in schools, allowing white flight to the suburbs as the poor and minorities stay behind in decaying inner cities. An increasing imbalanced economy also hit working women who faced shrinking job opportunities and stagnant pay. To stay above the poverty level, a woman depended on the financial support of an adult male breadwinner, yet divorce rates left more women and their children in poverty. New no-fault divorce laws lowered or eradicated alimony, pushing even middle-class women into poverty. Moreover, the majority of men defaulted on child support payments within 1 year after separation. Thus, divorced men enjoyed a sizable increase in their standard of living. Divorced women suffered a formidable decline. A sharp rise in teenage pregnancy reinforced this trend. Even with Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC, payments and food stamps, It was impossible for an unemployed single mother to keep their family above the poverty line. Among black women, the number of female-headed families increased in just one decade from 30% in 1970 to 47% in 1980. More than half of all black babies were now born to unmarried mothers. Population shifts mirrored other trends in the Reagan era. As the Sun Belt, from Florida to California, benefited from federal defense spending and retiree Social Security checks, cities like Phoenix, Houston, and Las Vegas, as well as most in California, boomed. Even so, income in the new urban areas followed national patterns, with Hispanics in the Southwest especially falling behind. Sunbelt states spent state and federal funds on police, roads, and services to new suburbs. Meanwhile, Rust Belt states suffered sharp declines in heavy manufacturing like cars, steel, shedding jobs and population. As farm income fell, family farms in the Midwest disappeared as well. By 1984, rural poverty rates were twice that of urban areas. As you can see, the population shifts from 1970 to 1980 occurred as a result of these trends during the Reagan era. Drug addiction and drug trafficking took on frightening new dimensions in the early 1980s. As crack addiction spread, the drug trade assumed alarming new proportions both domestically and internationally. While the Reagan administration launched a highly publicized war on drugs, and Nancy Reagan advertised, "Just say no," critics charged that drug addiction was primarily a health problem, not a law enforcement issue, and certainly not a threat to national security. In the early 1980s, doctors began encountering a puzzling syndrome of unusual infections and pneumonia in young gay men. After researchers at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta identified a virus as the cause, they called the new disease Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS. Many Americans perceived AIDS as a disease of homosexuals, but other victims became infected through intravenous drug use, drug transfusions, heterosexual transmission, or birth to AIDS-carrying mothers. AIDS provoked fear, anguish, and anger. In city after city, the gay community responded to the AIDS crisis with energy and determination. Reagan, playing to conservative anti-gay prejudices, ignored the epidemic, which had affected thousands and killed half of those infected. Reagan also refused to respond to a growing problem of homelessness among the urban poor. Homeless people wandered city sidewalks, panhandling and struggling to find scraps of food, with Vietnam vets, addicts, the mentally ill, and the simply poor and unfortunate among the estimated 3 million on the streets in the early 1980s, all victims of decline in public funding for drug and mental health treatment programs and affordable housing, or so critics charged. Reagan campaigned to restore America's world leadership, reviving Cold War patriotism and championing American interventionism in the Third World, especially in the Caribbean and Central America. His infusion of funds into national security programs would have enormous consequences for the domestic economy, as well as for America's position as a global power, even while internal changes within the Soviet Union made the entire Cold War framework of U.S. foreign policy largely irrelevant by the late 1980s. In a sharp turn from President Nixon's pursuit of détente and President Carter's focus on human rights, Reagan made anti-communism central to foreign policy. In 1983, he described the Soviet Union as an evil empire, the focus of evil in the modern world. Administration officials argued that during the 1970s, the nation's military strength had fallen dangerously behind that of the Soviet Union. Critics pointed out that the Soviet advantage in ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, was offset by U.S. superiority in submarine-based forces and strategic aircraft. Polls showed that 70% of Americans wanted détente, not an arms race, and in June 1982, 750,000 people, the largest political rally in American history, demonstrated in New York City for a halt to spending on and deployment of nuclear weapons. Far from being swayed, Reagan continued to increase military spending. In 1983, he further unsettled superpower relations with a 5-year, $26 billion Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI) plan for a space-based ballistic missile defense system dubbed Star Wars after the popular films. Despite criticism that the plan was unworkable, expensive, and destabilizing, Reagan pressed ahead, spending $17 billion in research before he left office without achieving any convincing results. The prospect of meaningful arms control dimmed in this atmosphere, and US-Soviet relations deteriorated. Declaring the Vietnam Syndrome over, Reagan asserted Americans' right to intervene anywhere in the world to roll back communism by overt and covert aid to anti-communist resistant movements, what became known as the Reagan Doctrine. Increased U.S. aid helped arm mujahideen, many of whom later supported the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, who drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan in the doctrine's greatest success. Blaming Castro for all problems throughout Central America, from 1980 and 1983, the United States poured more military aid into Central America than it had during the previous 30 years. In 1983, Operation to save the tiny island of Grenada from Marxist threats was condemned by the United Nations, but Reagan claimed, "We got there just in time." In El Salvador, the administration continued to support the pro-American but repressive regime with $5 billion in aid, funding right-wing death squads and failing to stop a bloody civil war. In Nicaragua, Reagan claimed the Sandinista government posed an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security and approved a CIA plan to arm and organize Nicaraguan exiles, known as Contras, to fight these Sandinistas, who predictably were only driven closer to Cuba and the Soviets. Scores of U.S. churches offered sanctuary to political refugees from Central America in protest, and in 1984, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, forbidding support to the Contra. Reagan turned to the National Security Council to find a way to keep the Contra war going, setting the stage for the enormously damaging Iran-Contra affair. Here we look at the United States in Central America from 1978 to 70. In the Middle East, the Iran-Contra scandal was a direct result of the contradictions of Reagan's policies and revealed a dangerous disdain for the rule of law in his administration. The threat of terrorism in the Middle East, Reagan insisted, loomed as one of the most serious threats to U.S. national security. Refusing to admit that pro-Israel American policy had alienated many in the Middle East, Reagan insisted that terrorism was funded by the Soviets. In 1986, Reagan launched bombing raids against Libya to show his anti-terrorist resolve. As a fierce war between Iraq and Iran escalated, the administration tilted publicly toward Iraq and its unsavory dictator Saddam Hussein to please the Arab states around the Persian Gulf. Reagan then secretly changed course and offered to supply Iran with weapons in exchange for helping free hostages held by Islamic radicals in Lebanon. Subsequent disclosures elevated the arms for hostage deal into a major scandal. To escape congressional oversight, Reagan and the CIA director William Casey turned the National Security Council into a covert agency using profits from arms sales to Iran to fund the Contras. In televised hearings, NSC staffer Oliver North defiantly defended his actions in the name of patriotism. Ultimately, the Iran-Contra investigation raised more questions than it answered. The full role of CIA Director Casey, who died in 1987, particularly his relationships with Oliver North and the president, remained murky. But by shredding documents and lying to Congress, North and NSC Director John Poindexter kept the scandal from reaching Reagan, who was able to maintain plausible deniability. In December 1992, following his re-election defeat and 6 years after the scandal broke, George H.W. Bush granted pardons to 6 key players in the Iran-Contra affair. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union moved towards collapse. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new Soviet leader. Although a lifelong communist, Gorbachev represented a new generation of disenchanted party members who wanted to end the Cold War and promote political and economic reform at home, otherwise known as perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. In Gorbachev's view, revival of the Soviet economy depended on halting the arms race, which was killing the Soviet economy. In 4 summit meetings with Reagan, Gorbachev moved haltingly toward disarmament. But political and economic reforms in the Soviet Union proved disruptive, with drastically reduced living standards and political uncertainty. In March 1989, the Soviet Union held its first open election since 1917, and a new Congress of People's Deputies replaced the old Communist Party-dominated Supreme Soviet. After Gorbachev announced that satellite nations would no longer be kept in line by force, pro-democracy movements broke out from Poland to Bulgaria. After dissidents tore down the Berlin Wall in 1989, unimpeded by German security police, the DDR collapsed and Germany moved quickly to reunification. One by one, socialist regimes collapsed across Eastern Europe. By Christmas Day 1991, the Soviet Union itself was dissolved, ending 50 years of Cold War superpower rivalry in what George H.W. Bush later termed an event of biblical proportions. In 1988, Republican candidate George Herbert Walker Bush hoped to ride on Reagan's coattails and also made strong pledge to voters, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Winning the general election handily over Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis with 40 out of 50 states and 56% of the popular vote, he began to move away from Reagan. In his inaugural address, Bush promised a kinder, gentler nation. In international affairs, Bush had prepared well to provide leadership in a dramatically changing world, having served as vice president, UN ambassador, envoy to China, and CIA director. However, he soon found himself facing a host of problems complicated rather than resolved by the end of the Cold War, as well as a Democratic Congress. Bush carried over several Reagan policies, such as the war on illegal drugs. With William Bennett as the new drug czar, Bush planned increased funding for more police and construction of more prisons. He also fortified the border patrols in an attempt to stem the flow of drugs from Latin America. In December 1989, Bush sent U.S. troops to Panama to capture General Manuel Noriega, an international drug dealer formerly on the CIA payroll. Thousands of Panamanians died, but Noriega was brought to the United States and tried on drug trafficking and racketeering charges. During the Bush presidency, the federal budget for drug control tripled. As a compassionate conservative, and despite the increased business opposition, Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, penalizing workplace discrimination against the disabled and requiring business and local governments to provide access to their facilities. Yet he vetoed a bill that would have provided 6 months of unpaid leave for workers with new children or family emergencies. Strengthened environmental laws pleased some, as did federal spending for higher educational standards. But Bush angered conservatives when he broke his tax pledge and signed an increase on the wealthy. As the Cold War ended, Bush faced new challenges in the Middle East. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi troops swept into neighboring Kuwait to seize control of its rich oil fields. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's military dictator, claimed Kuwait was an ancient province of Iraq, but he also coveted Kuwait's Persian Gulf ports and sought to punish Kuwait for exceeding OPEC quotas, driving down oil prices. The United States responded swiftly. On August 15th, President Bush launched Operation Desert Shield and ordered U.S. forces to Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf. After Hussein ignored UN sanctions and demands that he withdraw from Kuwait, Bush denounced him as another Hitler and, with congressional support, launched Operation Desert Storm on February 24th. It took only 100 hours to force Saddam Hussein's troops out of Kuwait, but the war failed to dislodge Hussein, who remained in power despite CIA attempts to overthrow him and repeated bombings of Iraqi military positions. The repercussions of the Gulf War were long-lasting. American soldiers in Saudi Arabia enraged Islamic militants who swore revenge, among them Saudi millionaire Osama bin Laden, a veteran of the Afghan war. Bin Laden's al-Qaeda organization began planning terror operations against Western interests in the Middle East, a harbinger of more terrible events to come. The Gulf War marked the high point of Bush's popularity, with his approval rating near 90%, higher than FDR's during World War II. Faced with a costly savings and loans crisis and a stagnant economy, Bush reneged on his campaign promises and worked with Democrats in Congress to raise taxes. In the 1992 campaign, Bush faced a formidable opponent, William Jefferson Clinton, a young, articulate, and intelligent New Democrat who made "It's the economy, stupid" the centerpiece of his campaign. Clinton promised deficit reduction and a tax cut for the middle class, taking advantage of Bush's portrayal of his own campaign promise not to raise taxes. Clinton also struck a conservative note by calling for responsibility by welfare recipients and pledging support for families, while also promising a business-friendly administration to promote job growth. Economic issues also fueled by the independent campaign of Texas billionaire H. Ross Perot, who, with his folksy East Texas twang, argued that a successful businessman such as himself was better qualified to solve the nation's economic woes than Washington insiders. Although failing to carry a single state, Perot scored 19% of the popular vote. Clinton, with only 43%, carried 32 states to win the presidency.